Hello and welcome to 18 WJTS Inform. I'm your host, Bill Potter. And as usual this week, State Senator Mark Messmer joins us in the studio to talk about what is happening in legislation. And we're going to talk about basically two bills that have gone from the Senate to the House, or some bills have come from the House to the Senate that are kind of the same. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here as always.
Well, we always really appreciate you taking time on Fridays to come in and talk with us. Well, let's talk about the first bill, which has to do with the age limit for buying cigarettes or vaping. As a federal law has been passed, and now the states, I guess if they want to, they can equalize that.
Right.
So let's talk about that.
Sure. Okay, so people say, well, if the federal law has already taken effect that raises the smoking age to 21, why does the state need to mess with it? Primarily because there's no way for the state to enforce a federal law.
Okay.
So you'd have to count on the federal regulators to come in and inspect cigarette shops, and they don't have the manpower nor the time nor the interest to police it. So Senate Bill 1 was the Senate bill that raised the smoking age to 21 for smoking, vaping products and tobacco, all treated the same. And it puts restrictions on if you're a tobacco shop, if tobacco is your primary item you sell, tobacco and vaping products, then anyone that enters has to be 21. If you're a retail store where that's not your primary business, then the 21 to enter is not a requirement.
Okay. But they should have to show ID
to
purchase
it. Yep. And right now there's penalties for selling to someone under 18, and as both the House and Senate bills are passed now, they both raise the penalty. The first offense right now is $200 if you sell to someone under 18, and when we raise it to 21, currently it raises that first offense to $600. I would imagine there might be some movement, on penalties as the process moves through, but I would think the penalties will go up just to heighten the interest from retailers to be diligent in carding people. And then the main difference between the House and Senate version is ours, if you have 4 offenses over a 6-month period, you could potentially lose your tobacco retail license. And in the House, it stretches that period out to if you have 4 offenses over a 3-year period, you can lose your license. The penalties go up for each offense, but ours would have a much shorter window of when those infractions would have to occur before you could potentially lose your ability to sell tobacco or vaping products. And the tobacco retailers were at the State House this week, when they knew those bills were being debated and voted on, and they're not real happy about the 3-year, broad stretch of time that is listed in the House bill now. So that'll be a point of contention that I'm sure we'll probably amend it down to 6 months, like our bill is today. And other than that, there's small differences between those two bills, and all the other regulations on carding requirements and rules for clerks. All those things will be hammered out and be the same before session runs out. But I had surveyed that in my pre-session survey, and it had pretty broad support. That raising the smoking age, seemed like a logical thing to do. If you can keep tobacco out of the hands of younger Hoosiers, the younger they start smoking, the more likely they are to become addicted and long-term smokers. Indiana has the 4th highest adult smoking rate population in the country. I think we're at 21.1% of our adult population still smokes. And curbing that would just lead to better health outcomes for everybody involved, and keeping vaping products and tobacco out of the hands of youth is by far in their best interest. If you can hold off getting people started, they're less likely to smoke as an adult.
Was the cigarette purchase age ever at 21? Seems like
it was 18.
It's always been 18?
Yeah, as far
Even
as
when
I
you
know.
and I were kids, it's always been 18?
Well, as far as I can remember.
Okay, all right. That's a long time, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have 2 bills one is the House's bill, and the other is the Senate's bill. Explain what happens next, because they're basically the same bill. So what
They're
what do
pretty
you
close.
guys do?
So I mean, we'll pass our Senate bill, which had passed. I think it was 40-9. I think is what it passed. It was bipartisan. There were some more Republicans voted against it. I think 7 of the 9 no votes were Republicans and 2 were Democrats, and the rest of so it was bipartisanly supported. Same in the House version. It was strong. I think there was like 80-12 or something. It was pretty strong bipartisan vote. Those bills will switch chambers, and in February we'll hear the House bill. They'll hear the Senate bill. More than likely they'll amend ours to be like theirs, and we'll amend theirs to be like ours, and we'll vote on them again. And then they'll go at the end of session. Undoubtedly, I mean, unless one or the other changes to the point where, the House or Senate, author says, we're okay with your version. But if either bill gets changed, then you either go to conference committee to iron them out and come up with one. You have to have one set of language that passes, both the House and the Senate. So that will more than likely be one that gets in the conference committee time at the end of February, the first week of March, and you have to hammer out the differences to get them, identical. And my guess is that'll be one of the final things that we wrestle each other with to get everything in sync.
And more than likely, it's going to pass
It
in one
should,
form or another,
yeah.
and then that would become law July 1st.
July
Is that
1st.
right? Okay. Okay. And other action in
The other big bill we dealt with this week, and it passed the House the first couple weeks of session. It passed the Senate yesterday. Was House Bill 1007. And as we finished up our budget last year in the middle of April, we had projections of where we thought revenue was going to be, from the prior budget. And in the last quarter, the revenues to the state, primarily through, sales tax is about 60% of our revenue. Personal income tax is the second biggest chunk. Business income tax is probably, a third, and then gaming revenue, is fourth. But the last quarter, our tax revenues, were about $300 million over what we had projected. Probably $200 million from that quarter and about $100 million from the whole, the prior budget year. So we had about $300 million additional dollars than what we expected. We had bonded about $300 million worth of university projects. I think there's 6 different projects at Purdue, IU. Up in Gary, Purdue, Fort Wayne, USI, USI and ISU. I think, there was just different campus projects around the state, and rather than bond those, if we bonded those projects and paid the interest on those bonds, it would have cost the state about another $135 million over the life of those bonds to finance them. And if we had the cash to pay for them, the governor said, okay, we've had some extra revenue from last budget cycle. And so, if we would have known it was going to be there, we would have paid cash for them. We typically pay cash for a lot of our university projects when the money's there. He said it makes better sense for the state to go ahead and pay for those now and not bond them for 20 years and pay all the additional, because that'll free up another, $5 to $6 million, every year for those future budget cycles. And there'd have been about $2 to $3 million worth of legal fees just to get the bonds, set up this year. So, a pretty big chunk of tax saving for Hoosiers, and things like that we do keep our AAA bond, rating in place. Which, when we do need to bond projects, if you have a AAA rating, your interest rates are as low as they can get. So, all of those things help save Hoosiers money in the long run.
This may be an odd question. $300 million. That's a lot of money. But is that a lot of money in relation to the budget?
The total budget's about $30 billion.
Okay.
Over the 2-year cycle. So 30 might be more, even more like 30. Yeah. So a pretty small percentage overall. Still leaves us about a little over $2 billion in reserves, and those aren't really all spendable reserves. We have about of our $2 billion in reserves. We have I think $500 million in a trust account for that finances road spending. We have about $300 million that are there to cover payments to schools. If there would be an economic downturn, it's a trust fund that's set up to keep school payments steady in future downturns in the economy. So I mean, there's not all of that $2 billion is really spendable cash. I mean, several of those are in dedicated, funds that are, that you really can't spend it. You just either spend the interest or they have to be there for a specific purpose. But I mean, it does keep our total reserves, at about that $2 billion range, which is about 45 days of operating cash for the state. So it's not a lot, in the grand scheme of things. But all of those things help, keep our AAA rating in place and future interest payments that, to a minimum, and just good fiscally sound policy to do and continue to do for the state.
Okay. Once again, thank you very much for coming in.
My
Look
pleasure.
forward to your visit next week.
Yep.
And there is another legislative breakfast that's set up for, I think, February 15th.
15th.
Looking forward to that, seeing you there at the C10 building at VU.
By that time, we'll be near the tail end of session.
Yeah, so that's one people need to plan to be to that. All right, well, thank you very
Okay,
much for
you're
coming
welcome,
in. I
as
really
always.
appreciate it. Our guest has been State Senator Mark Messmer, and this has been WJTS Inform. We are local people watching local people.